Assalamu alaikum. Shukran jazilan for coming today. I last came, well, let me start. Before I actually read my statement, I want to thank very much the authorities for having facilitated this visit. It's very important for me to have been able to do it. And as you know, I last came to Sudan in November 2022. And I remember still how deeply I was inspired by the spirit, the energy, and the dynamism of civil society, particularly the youth and women who led the 2018 revolution. So much has changed since then. But to those who believe the spirit of the struggle for peace, justice, and freedom has been broken through nearly 3 years of outrageous war on civilians, I have news for you. That spirit is not broken. Over the past 4 days, I have met with Sudanese in Port Sudan, in Dongola, in Adaba, and Merowe. I met with young people who are critical first responders to the needs of their communities, organizing and delivering aid, often in the face of sometimes also risking detention and violence. Their clarity of purpose came through, as one civil society leader told me, and I quote, "We don't have the power to stop the war, but we will do what we can to keep civilians alive." Another young volunteer said, and I quote, "The price of war is being paid by young people. Sudanese young people are at the front lines of this war, serving those who are in need of humanitarian aid." I met with women, legal aid, and humanitarian organizations that provide free assistance to women victims of violations and abuses that are linked to the war. Again, very often at great risks to themselves. I met with an engineer at the Merowe Dam and hydroelectric power station, which has been hit multiple times by drones launched by the RSF, most recently just 2 weeks ago. The senseless attacks disrupted essential power to hospitals, interrupted irrigation for crops, and disrupted access to clean water, facilitating the spread of diseases, and I have to say it also interrupted livelihoods for many people. Attacks on critical civilian infrastructure are serious violations that can amount to war crimes. The RSF, but I need to tell you what an engineer at the Merowe Dam told me. He said, "They didn't stop the attacks, and we will not stop our efforts to keep live the electricity of Sudan." He was undeterred and defiant, even when the latest attack directly hit the office where his team is working. And I have met with those who have been hardest hit by brutal violence and injustice in this war. At the Al-Afad site for internally displaced people in Al-Daba, I met a 4-year-old who lost his hearing due to bombardment and now doesn't play well with other kids. A 3-year-old who wouldn't smile. I met Hawa, who was working towards her master's degree in psychology when she had to flee Al-Fasher after losing her 19-year-old son due to shelling. En route, she recounted that she was looted, beaten, and her husband was abducted by the RSF and tortured in detention, demanding a ransom of 10 million Sudanese pounds. So many provided testimony of detained, disappeared, and missing family members and friends. One woman saw her husband and only son killed. She's still bedridden from grief, from trauma, and the bullet she took in her shoulder while trying in vain to shield her son. In her words, and I want the commanders to know this, in her words, on 20 October, we were fleeing from Al-Fashir on a donkey cart. It was the only transport we could afford. On the road to Garni village, there were lots of dead bodies. We saw armed men on camels who said, "Bring down the women." My brother tried to stop them. They shot him in his leg. My mother started crying and said, "Leave my children, take me instead of her." They hit her, took me and told me to keep quiet or they will kill my mother. Then what happened, happened. My period has not come since then. Sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war. This is a war crime, and we have more and more indications that this is widespread and systematic. I also heard accounts of widespread summary executions by RSF during the offensive on Al-Fashir for revenge, for suspected affiliation with the SAF or its allied joint forces. And prior to the offensive, one man told me of people killed for trying to bring milk and flour into milk powder and flour into Al-Fashir during the period when the RSF had the city under tight 18-month siege, imposing a man-made famine. We must ensure that the perpetrators of these horrific violations face justice regardless of affiliation. The terrifying experience of these survivors must provoke action to prevent this from happening to another Aisha, another Hawa, and to make sure they can access what they need: medical care, psychosocial care, justice, and support to pursue education and a livelihood. I'm very worried that the atrocity crimes committed during and after the takeover of Al-Fashir are at grave risk of repeating themselves in the Kordofan region, which has been rapidly escalating since late October. The Kordofan states are extremely volatile, with relentless military engagement, heavy shelling, drone bombardments, and airstrikes causing widespread destruction and collapse of essential services. Advances towards Kaduli by the RSF and SPLM-N and continued displacement of civilians from the besieged city, all in the context of extreme food insecurity with famine conditions confirmed in Kaduli and risk of famine in other areas, including Dilinj. The proliferation of it is despicable that large sums of money are being spent on procuring increasingly advanced weaponry, funds that should be used to alleviate the suffering of the population. It is time to get rid of old habits and bureaucratic hurdles in the provision of humanitarian assistance. It is through taking practical, confidence-building measures that steps can be taken towards mediation and peace. Measures such as accounting for missing persons and releasing civilians detained for alleged collaboration are also priority areas. Across the country, thousands of civilians have been detained on such accusations, impacting civil society actors, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and humanitarian volunteers. I repeat my call from 3 years ago, when I last visited Sudan. I urge all those involved to set aside entrenched positions. 3 years ago, I had also left Sudan with the plea that human rights have to be at the core of the transition. Sadly, they were not. And a brutal war upended the very real possibilities for the country to transition to democratic. Again, I leave with a plea that human rights be central to building confidence and bringing this horrific war to an end, to resuming the difficult task of building a sustainable peace. It is difficult, but certainly not impossible, with the resilience and power of the Sudanese people that I have seen myself again for the third time. My office and I myself are committed to doing whatever is necessary to advance this process. Shukran.